Next we go to the humanists and the existentialists. Now they're interesting because they come at the problem of what's wrong with people from a kind of a universalist perspective. Now, for Freud, if you weren't sick, you were healthy. And that seems obvious, because we think you can make a clear distinction between sick and healthy. But the existentialists, they didn't want any of that. Their hypothesis was, if you're human, you're sick. There's no way out of it. And the reason you're sick, in a sense, and unlike any other animal, is that life itself poses a paradoxical problem to you. Partly because you're so conscious and because you're self-conscious, and actually a sequence of paradoxical problems. A, how do you live when you're vulnerable and mortal? That's a rough one, because you might say, well, why should I bother at all, or who's going to know anyways in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years? Or why is there suffering, or how do you go on in the face of cruelty? And those are questions that grip at people's soul and crush it. And they're not a consequence of mental illness. It's like, what, how long should it take you to recover if your whole family is wiped out in a car accident? What's healthy? Well, we don't know the answer to that. It's like, should you ever recover? Maybe if you were halfway empathic, it would just kill you. You know, a lot of times people can't recover from their grief because they're guilty. They think, how can I live when all those people close to me died, and they died unfairly? Well, that's an existential problem. And then, so there's one class, which is vulnerability and mortality. Everyone's got that staring at them. So how do you deal with that? Hard question. Second class of problems. Well, everybody's always evaluating you. Always. And you're never good enough. So what that means is that you're always in an insufficient relationship with society and history. No matter how good you get, it's not good enough. And so history itself, as well as culture, always faces you as a judge. And so that's the second category of existential problem. Then the third problem is, well, what to do about you yourself. You know, there's nature you have to contend with, and there's culture you have to contend with, and then you've got yourself, and your self-consciousness, and your deep knowledge of all the things about you that could really use some repair. And the thing about those problems is that everyone has them, and they've always had them, and as far as we know, they always will. And so they're built into the condition of being human. And that's what existentialism is about. It's like, life is a paradoxical problem. Is there any possible solution to a paradoxical problem? Well, that's in some ways the question of the meaning of life. And one hint is that, well, what's the meaning of life? And one answer to that is, this is the hint, is that the meaning to life is the pattern of thought and action that you take that enables you to tolerate, at least tolerate, the conditions of life. And then maybe you could move one step beyond that if you're feeling a little optimistic and say, the meaning of life is the pattern of conception and action that enables you to welcome the conditions of life. And then you might ask yourself, well, is there such a mode of being? Given the nature of the problem that you have to contend with, is there actually a mode of being that would enable that? You could say, the vulnerability, the judgment, the insufficiency, it's worth it under these conditions. And that's the other existential question. And the people who posed those questions, they weren't messing around. You're going to read people like Frankl, Viktor Frankl, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And what those two people lived through, I mean, it's unimaginably horrible. And when they were wrestling with the questions that I just described, they weren't academic issues. They were embodied issues of life and culture and genocide and cruelty. And so their examination of that had to be deep enough to be able to contend with questions like that. And answers that are deep enough to contend with questions like that are frightening answers. Then we have reading week. It'll be a relief.
Clean up your room. Then you'll know what to do next. I had a girl come up to me last night. She said, I started cleaning up my room and it completely changed my life. She said, your room is an externalization of your mind. And that's right. That's exactly true.